Hi, everyone. My name is Nicolea Dow. I'm a farmer from Portage, Prairie, Manitoba. I'm one of the directors of Manitoba Canola Growers, and I've also been involved in the committee that's developed the new canola shatter rating. And today, myself and Taryn Dickson are here to talk to you about the canola shatter rating. Now, this is part of it's a harvest management tool, and when we look at the goals of getting canola bushel average up, harvest management is a piece of that, and it's the theme of the Canola Discovery Forum. And so it fits in really nicely to be able to introduce the rating today, to share with you the background of how we developed it, as well as what the rating itself is. So I'm going to start off and tell you a bit about how the rating came to be and the team that has worked to put it together. And Taryn is going to share more about the rating itself. Now, in order to tell you about how it came to be, I want to tell you a bit about, or refresh your minds at least, about the 2020 growing season. And every season has different challenges for farmers. We've had some challenges this year in 2021, and 2020 was no different. Every year there's challenges, and every year they're a little different. And on my farm, had a lot of loss in our canola, more than we had experienced, at least for me, in any other year of straight cutting canola. And you can see in the picture, there's a whole host of things going on here. You can see there are some stems of mature canola plants, but most of them are quite green. This was taken a day or two before we combined. And actually there were sections of this field that were so green, we had to leave them. And yet there's significant loss going on. You can see whole pods, you can see pods that are split open, and you can see canola seedlings already growing. And so the 2020 harvest season was difficult, and a lot of farmers had fields that looked like this. And so we had a lot of questions, and I think it was, even if we're honest, some moments of humility where, we had been straight cutting for a number of years and thought that we understood what we were doing pretty well. And then a change happened, and something we didn't quite understand what was going on. And so there was frustration, there were questions, and we were trying to figure out what to do. Now, in hindsight, I can think about the rest of the things that happened that growing season. At the time, when you're there with a combine, you just feel frustrated that your field is not looking very good. And you're trying to think of, what can I blame for this? But in hindsight, there were a lot of things that happened in that growing season. Much like this year, it was extremely hot. It was very dry. And if you look on the map where my farm is in Portage, Prairie, I can't say we're the worst off of anyone, but if you look on both that heat stress map, we are in one of the more severe areas. And on the precipitation map, again, we're in that yellow zone. We're in one of the more severe areas. And those hot, dry conditions got partnered with some extreme winds as well. So at least in Manitoba, we had that. I think other parts of the prairies did as well. You can see highlighted from the Manitoba Ag Report, the town of Snowflake had 137 days with wind over 50 kilometers an hour. And particularly in the fall season, as the canola was maturing, we had some really high winds, and wind loss in canola swaths, in standing canola, was really prevalent. So these conditions and the losses that farmers experienced, they emphasized a few needs. They emphasized that we needed some better education about canola harvest losses. Again, if on my farm, we had been straight cutting for probably 5 or 6 years at this point. It's a practice we've been doing since pod shatter genetics came out. We thought we had a good handle on it, and suddenly we realized that, there's probably some knowledge gaps here. And it also highlighted a need of having some better tools in the field for risk assessment and for trying to make some management decisions at harvest time. So following that harvest in Manitoba, the Manitoba canola growers we got together for our board meeting, and we always spend time rehashing the season and what went well and what didn't. And this, of course, was one of the big topics of conversation for us. And so wanting to do something to help mitigate this problem for the future. We can't change the weather, but we started looking at what could we do. And so we decided that we would bring a motion to the WCCRRC to develop a pod shatter rating. Now, ratings like this are not the direct purview of the WCCRRC, but it was a place where all of the right people were. And so we thought it was a good avenue and a good place to bring something like this forward to get all the right people on board. So we did. We brought a motion. We had support from the other provincial commodity groups, and we gained support from the governance committee at the WCCRRC to go ahead and to channel the development of this rating through their group. So we revitalized a pod shatter committee that was already in existence. I stepped in as the new chair of that subcommittee, and it was a diverse group that came together to solve this problem. So there was farmers represented from Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. We had really broad representation from the seed and breeding industry. I think every major private breeder was represented in this group. And we also had a lot of support and members of that subcommittee from groups like the Canola Council, like Ag Canada as well. And this group came together, and we had a lot of discussion about what the best way forward was. And we wanted to consider what were the real needs that farmers had. Admittedly, this request was really kind of coming out of a bit of frustration as farmers. And so our group first had to work and say what was actually needed. And so we talked about what had gone on in the field. We talked about what the breeders knew and the perspective that they came from, which as a farmer was something I learned a lot from. And we also talked about what the seed companies needed. A rating like this is voluntary. It's not something that's mandated. And so in order for it to be successful, we needed it to be something that would work for everyone. And so this group came together to work on that. And we determined that, yes, we were going to develop a rating, but perhaps more importantly, we wanted to work on an education plan in conjunction with Canola Council that would go with the rating, and that would really make the rating more than just numbers, but a true success. And I do want to just highlight the way that this group came together and the way that this rating came to be, because as a farmer, it's something I'm really proud of. And I think it shows the success of the canola industry working together. Farmers had a need in the field. We were able to use the voice of the provincial commodity canola groups to make that need known, to bring it to a larger stage, and have an industry that was willing to rally around that need, to come together and to work to develop something that would function well for everyone. The issue really that we dialed in on as far as developing the rating is that there's variation in shattering. There's a lot of things that contribute to harvest loss, but we determined that really the one that we could isolate and actually put a rating to that would have some meaning is shatter. And so you can see represented in these pictures that fields can range from fields that are very intact with no shatter, all the way to plants that are extremely shattered out. And you can see kind of that whitish color in the pods. And so although there's a lot of things that are very environmental, very out of our control, this is the factor that we dialed in on that we could assign a rating to. And so we chose to take an approach that's similar to how some disease ratings are done. And so we went forward wanting to make a standardized rating. In a way, it's a common nomenclature that could be used across the industry so that when we talk about risk of canola shatter, we can all use the same language. So this is something that will provide farmers with a clear way to assess a cultivar for shattering. This will be really helpful both at the beginning of the season when we're selecting which cultivars we're going to order seed from, and also through the season of how you're going to manage those fields. Most farms grow more than one cultivar of canola, and so knowing how do I prioritize things at harvest, what can I expect? The environment and what happens with that is totally out of our hands, but we can have at least something that is going to help set the expectations and be really essential in managing harvest timing and making decisions at that time of year. Now I'm going to turn it over to Taryn to go through the key details of what the rating is, what the rating isn't, and explain the technical side of the rating more fully.
Thanks, Nicola. I'll just provide a couple clarifications around pod shatter and pod drop before discussing the pod shatter ratings. So canola harvest losses can be the result of pod drop, which is the snapping of the entire pod or sleek at the raceme pedicel junction and dropping to the ground, where the raceme is also referred to as a main or secondary stem, and the pedicel is that small stem which attaches the pod to the main or secondary stem. Or harvest losses can be the result of pod shatter, which is when a pod or sleek have split open and the seeds drop to the ground, where while the pedicel remains attached to the raceme, creating that white appearance that Nicola mentioned earlier. It is also important to recognize that pod drop and pod shatter are not the same thing, and they are two different events influenced by different parameters. So current research indicates that pod shatter and pod drop are controlled by different genes of the plant as well. And pod shatter is highly related to the genetic background, whereas pod drop is more influenced by environmental conditions. And this is important to realize in considering if or how either pod shatter or pod drop can be prevented or predicted in order to better manage these losses. So this illustration was created to depict and explain pod drop and pod shatter, and it's available on the Canola Council of Canada website. Also, just to draw your attention to the top right corner, where the illustration indicates the difference between a pod shatter susceptible pod and a pod shatter resistant pod. So you can check that out. And then as you would see it in the field, pod drop is where you'd have those pods that have fallen to the ground, and pod shatter where the pods have split open and you see half of that pod still attached in that white replum, which creates that whitish color when you look across the field. So keeping in mind that pod shatter is highly related to genetic background, it follows that canola breeding can have an impact on shatter resistance, where some cultivars are highly resistant to shattering, while others have some intermediate resistance to shattering, and all will eventually shatter, which helps explain some of the variation that was noticed between canola growers' fields. Or simply put, canola cultivar A may not be equal to canola cultivar B when it comes to shattering, and therefore should not be treated equally either. The maturity and resistance of each cultivar can be assessed separately when it comes to choosing harvest practices and selecting harvest timing, and knowing that any cultivar that is left out for too many weeks past the recommended harvest timing will have issues regardless of the cultivar. And related to the previous clarification, remember that genetic resistance to pod shatter will not prevent pod drop, and there are no claims by seed companies about pod drop. So taking this all into consideration, the Canola Shatter Rating Subcommittee agreed that the Canola Shatter tool should represent canola cultivar's level of shatter risk, allow cultivars to be considered relative to designated checks, and those being 45H33 and L255 PC, which anchor the claim based on the seed provider's data. But it should not depict a specific percentage of shatter, as this tool should provide qualitative ratings rather than quantitative ones. So here it is. Based on these stipulations and considerations, this canola shatter ratings graphic was drafted. And as you can see, it has a scale of 1 to 9, where 1 has the highest risk of shattering, as indicated by the plant and the diminishing number of seeds overlaying that wedge shape in the background, and 9 has the lowest risk of shatter. Swathing is recommended for ratings 1 to 4. And those reference cultivars 45H33 and L255PC are rated as a 4 and an 8. Also to note, the ratings are not a promise or performance guarantee, and it's still suggested that growers consult their retailers for recommendation. So this draft graphic will be shared for use once it's finalized. As Nicolea mentioned, the use of these shatter ratings can provide a valuable assessment of canola shatter to help set growers' expectations and allow farmers to develop better plans for harvest operations and thereby manage harvest risk losses every year, hopefully. And just want to acknowledge everyone that was involved with this, everyone from the Canola Shatter Ratings Committee, especially Nicolea, who is the previous chair, and John Mako, the current chair of this committee. Thanks. And now, if we have a few more minutes, we can take your questions in the Q&A session.